Well, thrilled that you all are here. And to help us understand the global landscape of toxic polarization and what we can learn from experiences abroad, we are joined by three distinguished scholars. First, we have Scott Straus from UC Berkeley. Scott is a professor of political science and the 2023 Mahatma Gandhi Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. As a leading expert on political violence, genocide, and human rights, he will be kicking us off with his insights. And then next, we'll hear from another of my wonderful colleagues at UC Berkeley, Amanda Clayton. Amanda is an associate professor of political science whose work focuses on women's political representation and climate governance. And finally, we are thrilled to welcome Daniel Ziblatt back to his alma mater. Daniel is the Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University and known globally for his research on democracy and democratic erosion. So with that, we'll have Scott Straus start us off, and I will try to be a good timekeeper.
Well, thank you all for staying this long in the day. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to take my chair's hat off and try to be a scholar for 10 minutes, 15 minutes again, and really pleased to do that. So you have to understand where I'm coming from. So I study civil war, I study genocide, I study total breakdowns of society. And I think the question that I wanted to ask for today was what we've learned about the causes of civil war or the causes of organized large-scale violence. Are there insights for thinking about what might happen in the United States? And in particular, whether or not polarization, whether it's pernicious polarization or toxic polarization or effective polarization or just prejudice, can in fact drive large-scale violence, and could that happen here? So I'm going to ask really kind of three questions. The first is, does toxic polarization lead to large-scale political violence? Does it cause large-scale political violence? The second, which I know may seem absurd, but I'm going to try to justify the question to you, is the United States on the brink of civil war or large-scale political violence? This is an argument that a number of people have made, and I'll make reference to that in just a second. And then lastly, I'm going to turn the question around and ask about what are the effects of violence on political polarization or on polarization more generally. So I think getting to some of the questions that Mina was talking about earlier. So a couple of caveats. I am not an Americanist. I study the rest of the world. And one of the things that's really nice about sitting in my position as chair is I get to see how incredible my colleagues are. And one of them who's so incredible is Eric Schickler. And I know that from reviewing all of this incredible work. And my comments are going to be a little bit in tension with his, which gives me a lot of pause, because he knows the United States a lot better than I do. And so we'll see where that goes. The second is I'm not going to present a paper. I'm really presenting, I don't have slides. I'm really going to be talking about sort of, my synthesis of a literature and of scholarship and trying to apply it in a comparative way. So it's not like this is not something that I've studied in depth, but I'm going to take you give you what I understand to be the case and kind of think about that in the context of the United States. Okay. So the first question is, does political polarization or does polarization drive large-scale political violence? And I would say that there is not a simple answer to that question, shockingly, in academics. I would say that the field of political violence hasn't really framed the question in that way. It's framed it slightly differently. And it's important to note that there are lots of different kinds of political violence. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. There's assassinations, there's fighting in the streets over people in different political parties. There's rioting, there's terrorism, there's civil war, there's torture, there's police violence, et cetera. So what I'm going to be talking about here is really kind of organized, large-scale political violence where there's some deliberate effort to inflict physical harm on a large scale for a political purpose, generally for the purpose of seizing power or maintaining or keeping power. Okay? So I think the closest analog to the question that, as I'm framing it, is the question of whether or not deep cleavages, typically identity cleavages, those could be ethnic cleavages, religious cleavages, or other kinds of identity-based cleavages drive political violence. And I think the assumption, if you're just allowed for a second, although I think it's problematic, is that identity-based cleavages function like politically based cleavages. And I think, again, the previous panel, I think, raised this question. But let's just assume that for just a second, although I want to challenge that in a little bit. So I'd say while there's not like perfect consensus on this question, the sort of center of academic gravity on this question leans away from the idea that cleavages cause political violence, that these kinds of cleavages cause political violence. And I think the couple of reasons why. One is that various cross-national studies and even sort of in-depth individual case studies that try to link measures of diversity in various ways to the outbreak or onset of civil war in particular generally have a null finding when you're controlling for other things. But in general, it's a null finding. And there's a kind of consensus that there are other things that matter more, which I'll get to in just a second. Okay? Second, if you kind of drill down on what are the mechanisms that would lead from cleavage to violence, some of the things that we talked about this morning, animosity, vilification, dehumanization, ignorance, and so forth, the things that we expect to find cause violence. In general, the people who study these places where there is violence tend not to find that those are the animating mechanisms that lead to violence. In fact, we find that there's a lot of interconnections between people. There's not a lot of, like at the sort of mass level, there's a lot of interconnections, a lot of, people are not animated by hatred all the time, okay? There, I think, is the truth that leaders generally start violence, and they can build on cleavages that exist in a society. That kind of is a kind of resonance for them. They can motivate violence through cleavages. But the model of like, you know, from below that mass beliefs and mass animosity or mass hatred or polarization or prejudice, and we could disentangle some of these, you know, boil up to cause outbreaks of civil war, I think that model most academics who study this would reject for the most part. So I think that's one point. So I would say one addendum to that literature is that one cause of civil war and organized violence is something that scholars call horizontal inequality. And the basic idea here is that when you have unequal access to both political and economic power, and that unequal access is kind of clustered on identity, that then you get people who will use violence to try to change that kind of distribution of power. So the mechanism here is less about identity-based differences and more about the idea that there is exclusion and that you can boil that exclusion down to some type of cleavage, some type of identity. And and I'll come back to that in just a little bit, in just a second. So I think that, on balance, I would say that the literature tends to see political violence as having top-down elite origins, and to say that mass animosity is not the driver of political violence, to the extent that there is a mechanism that deals with cleavages. It has to do with this idea of exclusion, and in particular, where exclusion is clustered around a particular identity. Okay. So I'll just caveat for just 1 second that, well, actually, I'll come back to that in just a second. All right, so the United States. So now here I'm going to get into not like forecasting. I'm just going to try to give you my analysis of the situation rather than making a prediction, because I share the concern about making predictions. There's lots of things we don't know. So the question is the United States on the brink of large-scale political violence? And this is not an idle question. You can scoff at the movie that came out in 2024 called Civil War. There have been a couple of popular books along these lines. But there are, I think, some real issues to take into consideration. One is that there is polling that suggests that a sizable number of Americans are willing to use political violence for political purposes. You may know that many elected officials fear political violence, and they either don't sleep at home or they have some kind of bodyguards or whatever. It's a present concern for them. And of course, we've witnessed January 6th, and we've witnessed police violence recently, or forms of police violence, as well as political assassinations, whether it be Charlie Kirk or attempts of political assassination. So it's a question that's in the air, and I think it's an important one to ask. On the scholarly side, the sort of most advanced argument comes from a scholar named Barbara Walter, who wrote a book a couple of years ago, which became a New York Times bestseller, called How Civil Wars Start and How to End Them. And in various forms, I've heard her say, civil war is inevitable in the United States. And she's someone who studied civil wars her whole life. Okay? She's not an Americanist, but someone like me who studies it in an international context. Okay? And so I just wanted to take a little analysis of that book and then try to build out some lessons from that book. So the core variable, and maybe this will speak to what Professor Ziblatt will speak about, I'm not sure, is what she calls anocracy. And the idea of anocracy is that you have some type of mixed regime, that it combines components of an autocracy and a democracy. And for the United States, the idea is that we have backslided into one of these hybrid regimes, a kind of competitive authoritarian. It has different names, competitive authoritarian, hybrid, anocracy. There are some differences between them. But the idea is that we're no longer, in the United States, a full-fledged democracy. We're combining elements of autocracy and democracy. When you couple that with what she calls factionalism, which broadly, in the way that she defines it, is polarization, that you get a kind of toxic mix that can lead to civil war. And the sort of third variable that she introduces is the idea of formerly high-status groups losing status, right? So her model here is that downgraded groups in anocracies that are dominated by ethnic factions or dominated by political factions will lead to civil war. Okay. So I think this is a prediction, and it's a model that suggests that the United States is at risk of some type of organized political violence. So what do we make of this analysis? So I'm curious if Dan will speak to this or not. So the first thing I would just say is that this is one model of how civil wars start, but I wouldn't say is like the dominant model in the literature. And I would say there's much more consensus on a couple of other variables in addition to horizontal inequality. The first is income. Generally, civil wars start in low-income countries, and the interpretation of that is twofold. One is that lower income countries have lower state capacity, and lower state capacity translates into the inability for militaries to essentially stamp out insurgencies, okay, to put down rebellions. Okay? And the second interpretation is that lower income places are places where the so-called opportunity costs for high-risk rebellion are low. In other words, you imagine that your future isn't very good because you're in a relatively poor place, and so you're willing to accept the risk of engaging in civil war, highly costly behavior. And I would say on both of these counts, like the United States is significantly in a different territory. Obviously, it's a very high-income place. It has an exceptionally good military, a very strong military. And I would say on the economy in particular, and I want to sort of stress this because there's been a kind of underlying theme, is that there would be enormously high costs to a total breakdown of society. And that was not just for like ordinary recruits, but it's for the elites who would potentially be the ones who would be engaging in fomenting this kind of violence. So I think the economic structure of the United States is a significant restraint on the escalation of violence. There is a huge amount to lose, and that cuts across parties and cuts across identities. I think a second concern is that for the models that look at regime type, that is, that look at hybrid regimes or anocratic regimes that Barbara Walter is talking about, in general, it's not the backsliders that go from democracy to a hybrid state. It's the autocratic states that go into the sort of middle range. And by contrast, what we have in the United States and we have in some other places is we have the shift in the other direction, right? And I think this is a difference that matters. And the reason why I think this is a difference that matters is that the model of, like, an important element or dynamic to political violence is that those elites or those they want to try to recruit into violence think that they don't have another option except violence in order to pursue their aims, right? And so, by contrast, in the United States today and where we're coming from, there are still lots and lots of ways to contest power. Right? We still have I mean, whether Eric's non-0% probability that we'll have canceled elections, but like at least till this point, right? You have elections. You have, I still think, a very vibrant civil society. I mean, when I look around at the other places that I know that have fallen into civil war, and you compare the thickness of civil society in the United States, these are apples and oranges in terms of the amount that you'd have to cut through that would act as a restraint on the escalation towards violence. I think business elites, universities, the press, I mean, again, we can find ways in which many of these institutions have degraded, but they are going to be a strong pushback against the escalation of violence. So again, it's not to say that these elements haven't been weakened, these institutions haven't been weakened, they're more polarized in ways that I think cause us all a tremendous amount of anxiety, but I think that they still constitute a significant restraint, and they speak to the fact that we have been for a very long time a democratic place. And then I think the third point I would make is that when you look at the political violence that's happened in the United States today, it has more often than not been sort of unorganized violence, right? It tends to be individuals who've been radicalized for one way or another, and they're engaging in assassinations or they're engaging in a shooting somewhere. But you're not really seeing movements who are calling for, people who are calling that we need to fight in order to stay in power. So I think January 6th is the one exception to that rule, but on the whole, I think that I don't really see the emergence of organized violence happening right now. And then lastly, I think when it comes to this question of stacking of cleavages, I mean, I sort of end up a little bit where Mina does, which is that I think that there are, many cross-cutting cleavages that still exist in the United States, at least when I compare them to other places that I know that have fallen into civil war. And that I think there is an argument that there is a kind of stacking around identity, but I think there is as much to argue against that as there is to argue that for that. And so I think, and in particular, I think the economy is a place where there's a lot of mutual interests, and I think that's going to be a real restraint on the escalation of violence. So it's not necessarily one has to worry about making a prediction, but that's at least the way I view the situation right now. So the last point, set of points I want to make, I have 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, terrific, okay. So I want to also end by saying that violence, when it happens, is extremely costly, not only for economies, infrastructures, states, but also for trust and for the creation of division. And the places that I know that have fallen into civil war, the places where I have observed political violence, the tacking back from political violence is extremely difficult. And the message is like, it should be a huge bright line for us. That what animates people a lot is fear and distrust. And when people fear each other in terms of their own survival, it becomes very difficult to see mutual interests in society. And it's violence that causes that fear. So I think, I'm very pessimistic. I learned a lot today, but from what I study, I'm pessimistic that when violence happens, that it's easy to tack back from it. And so I think that's a concern. So looking forward, the things that I am sort of would worry me more than I'm already worried is, I think, political exclusion. right? If there is some type of political exclusion and it's stacking around questions of identity, and it's organized, I think that becomes, for me, a much higher risk. So canceled elections, that's a big deal, right? For example. I think if economic interests are overlap significantly with ethnic cleavages or identity-based cleavages, I think that's also a risky environment. And lastly, I would say, like, secessionism is probably the model. When I think through what might happen in the United States, where there could be escalation, given the high income environment that we're in, I would say secessionism would be the most likely scenario, where you would say, West Coast countries decide to become independent, or the Northeast decides to become independent. I think that's still extremely unlikely, and I don't really see that in the political discourse right now. But should that occur, I would say that would be particularly concerning for me. So thank you very much. Yeah.
The clicker. Hi, thank you so much. I have learned so much today. It's just been thrilling to be here. Today, I'm going to talk to you about polarization on a particular issue that was brought up actually in the Q&A at one point, which is climate. So I'm going to talk about political polarization on the issue of climate change. And I'm going to try to convince you that gender is actually an underappreciated facet of what drives political polarization on this issue, particularly in the global north, so in countries like the United States. So let me start with an established finding. This is something that we actually already knew before I started researching this. And this comes from advanced democracies, so places like the US or in Europe. And this is that women tend to express more concern about climate change than do men and are more supportive of climate change mitigation policies. And when my co-author and I, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, when we set out to do this research several years ago, we had just a very basic question, because we're also comparativists, which is, does this gender gap exist in other countries? And what we found really surprised us. So we found that actually this climate gender gap, it's not stable across place. It only exists in some countries. And in fact, it's highly correlated with GDP per capita. So let me show you what that means. What I'm showing you here are several surveys over the last 5 years or so from reputable survey companies or survey initiatives, so like the European Social Surveys, the Americas Barometer, the Pew Global Attitude Surveys that have really good, high-quality representative samples across many different countries. And we see, and so what I'm showing you on the x-axis here is log GDP per capita, so you can think of that as economic development. On the y-axis, I'm showing you the gender gap in climate concern. And this is standardized within countries, so if you see like Norway here at the top, that means that women in Norway are 0.4 standard deviations more concerned about climate change than are men. These differences are huge. They're usually about the same size as the differences between political parties on this issue, okay? And what's interesting, though, is that we don't see that these gender gaps exist in poorer countries of the world. We see sort of a middle gender gap in these middle-income countries, places like Guyana, Hungary, Lithuania, and then the gap grows. And it's not just the US, right? It's Norway, Sweden, Finland, places where we might not expect. And there's one other pattern that I want to show you that I think is really sort of instructive here in trying to understand the origins of the gender gap. And now what I'm showing you is I'm zooming in on one particular survey, so I can compare across countries that have the exact same question. This is from the Pew Global Attitude Survey. And I'm showing you the average levels of concern for men in blue and women in orange across levels of economic development. And what we see is that actually everyone in the global south, so places like Burkina Faso, Uganda, Nigeria, both men and women in those countries, those types of countries, express a lot of concern about climate change. Usually this is a 4 out of 4, I'm highly concerned about this issue. And it actually decreases for both men and women as we go along the spectrum of economic development, but this decline is especially pronounced among men, right? So if I go back to the last graph that I just showed you, It's not the case, actually, that women express more concern about climate change when countries are wealthier. Rather, it's that men express less concern when countries are wealthier. So when we came across these data, my co-author and I just had this as our foundational motivating puzzle. So why is the gender gap in climate concern correlated with country wealth? And I'm going to try to argue that it has a lot to do with the politics of climate skepticism and how gender relates to this. So at its essence, our theory is that climate change is just not a politicized issue in the global south, in poorer countries. This is for many reasons that I could talk about that you're probably thinking of now, but chief among them is that these places like Uganda, like Burkina Faso, like Haiti, they just aren't contributing to global greenhouse gas emissions to the same level that there are calls either by domestic audiences or by international audiences that they reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, that they decarbonize. And moreover, if they do decarbonize, usually it's funded by the global north, right? So there's not a lot of loss, there's not a lot of cost to climate action in those contexts. In contrast, when you start to move to higher emitting countries, there are more calls from both domestic and international audiences to reduce emissions, to decarbonize, because these countries do actually contribute to the problem. And these actions to combat climate change, particularly those related to pricing carbon or regulating fossil fuels, they become costly, and they become costly to usually industry elites that have entrenched interests in the continuation of fossil fuels. And it won't surprise you that when climate change is politicized, the issue typically falls into clear ideological camps, right? Opposition tends to be concentrated on the political right. Okay, how does that relate to the gender gap? So this is the part of our theory that we are really interested in testing. So we think that when right-wing parties develop anti-climate messages, they tend to highlight the cost to climate action that resonate most strongly with men, or more strongly with men than with women. So I think this is actually just best illustrated by a few examples from a case that we all know well, the US. But I will say these types of examples are really, you see them across wealthy countries. So here, for instance, we have Ted Cruz, the last presidential election. He says, "Let me say at the onset, Kamala can't have my gun, she can't have my gasoline engine, and she sure as hell can't have my steaks and cheeseburgers." Right? So he's like highlighting the cost to decarbonization, the cost to fighting climate change, as someone is going to take something away from me, and those things maybe actually have some cultural value to me, right? And we would argue that things like gasoline engine, steaks and cheeseburgers, sometimes those types of costs can resonate with the cultural identity of men more than with women. And Josh Hawley, actually, to our surprise, said this sort of quiet part out loud here. He says, boys in schools are taught that manhood is inherently dangerous, that it contributes to climate change, that they need to renounce their masculinity, right? So we actually have right-wing parties making a connection between climate skepticism on the one hand and masculinity on the other hand. So this is a key part of our argument, right? In higher emitting countries, because of political polarization on this issue, mascu and climate skepticism will become linked. And I want to show you some data that I think is consistent with this. So first question I want to sort of ask here and show you some data on is, does political resistance to climate change mitigation grow in wealthier countries? And I'm going to show you pretty convincingly the answer here is yes. So I'm going to use data from the Manifesto Project. This collects party platforms from countries around the world. The countries that you see here in this map are included in this data set. And I'm going to use these data to show you 4 findings. So first, I'm going to show you that party attention to climate change is higher in wealthy countries. I'm going to show you that this is true not just for parties on the left, where you might expect it, but also for political parties on the right. I'm going to show you, and this is the part that, again, is sort of canonical wisdom at this point, that resistance to climate action is higher for right-wing parties than it is for left-wing parties. But important for our argument that resistance is higher for right-wing parties in wealthier countries in particular. So let me walk you through these findings. What I'm showing you here is, again, log GDP per capita is on the x-axis, so this is economic development. On the y-axis, we just count the number of what we call like climate keywords in these political party manifestos. So things like climate change, net zero, emissions, wind, solar, but also things that are sort of like right-wing coded, like climate hoax, right? And what this simply shows you is that the presence of these words across parties are much higher in wealthier countries, places like Canada, the US, Australia, Norway, than they are in poorer countries. So this is already some prima facie evidence, right, that like climate change begins to enter the political scene only after a certain level of economic development. What I'm showing you here is rather than averaging at the country level, I'm just showing you the individual parties, right? And so I'm breaking it down by parties. You'll recognize some here, the Republican Party in the US, the Alternative for Germany in Germany. And you'll see that I've broken them down by parties on the right in red, parties in the middle, so the center parties in gray, and then parties on the left in blue. And what you see here, again, it's not just that it's the left-wing parties that all of a sudden care about climate change when countries are wealthier, but actually the rate of change, this slope, is steeper for right-wing parties. Right-wing parties also begin to take stances on the issue of climate change when countries are wealthier. What I'm showing you here is just that the percentage, so conditional on a political party making a statement about climate change, is it pro or anti-mitigation? That's what I'm showing you on the y-axis here, so the percent of statements that are explicitly against mitigation policies. And then I'm showing you now on the x-axis the right-left ideological index. So the blue parties on the left are those that are more left-leaning. The right parties on the right are more right-leaning. I'm just showing you here that opposition tends to be concentrated among political parties that are on the right. But moreover, what I'm showing you here is that this tendency to be anti-mitigation, even if we're just looking at right parties, grows as a function of economic development. So conditional on saying anything about climate change, if you're a right-leaning party in a poor part of the world, you're not taking a stance against it. It only becomes political to oppose climate change for right-leaning parties when you are in wealthier countries, so places like the Netherlands, Germany, the United States. Okay, so I hope that I've convinced you that climate change becomes a politicized issue when countries are wealthier. Now I want to connect this to the climate gender gap. And this part of our argument that has to do with, do climate messages resonate more strongly with men than with women? And I think that there's a lot of evidence consistent with this. So an implication of our theory is if I'm telling you that it's right-leaning parties that are promoting these messages, then the gender gap should be stronger among those who identify on the political right than those who identify on the left. These are data from the European Social Surveys, which is surveys across 28, I think, countries in Europe. And we see exactly this, right? So we see that climate concern is higher for individuals on the left. There is still a gender gap there, but the gender gap is much higher for individuals who are on the political right. And we've been talking a lot about stacked cleavages versus cross-cutting cleavages. And I find it really interesting here that actually conservative women in these European countries are closer to liberal men than they are to conservative men, right? So this is something where actually gender is doing more work than political party, which is not something that we often see. We looked at other types of issues too, immigration, et cetera. You don't see the same types of patterns. There's something really specific about climate change here that is causing this within party polarization by gender. Okay. We were lucky that the last round of the European Social Survey had this sort of this question on climate concern, but they also had a question on masculinity. So they asked both men and women, how masculine do you feel? So what I'm showing you on the x-axis is a scale of 0 to 6, not at all masculine to very masculine. What I'm showing you are predicted probabilities when you even control for other sorts of identities, including political ideology and political party, as well as socioeconomic indicators. And what I'm showing you is that men who report that they feel more masculine, controlling on everything else, express less concern for climate change than men who report feeling less masculine. And this is not the case for women, right? And we can talk about reasons why that might be. And then next I want to show you, so I've argued, right, that these two types of identity of masculinity and climate skepticism become linked when countries are wealthier. That's what I'm showing you in these data, and again, this is just data from Europe, so these are already relatively wealthy countries, right? But even within Europe, we see this trend. So in places like Serbia, Poland, Greece, these identities are not connected. You ask people about climate change, you ask people about masculinity, they might have strong opinions, but they aren't moving together, right? They only become connected, attached, right? The correlation begins to appear when countries are wealthier. Okay, so with this in mind, I wanted to end with thinking about, okay, what does this mean for effective climate policy? One thing I've been thinking a lot about in the literature on how to get people concerned about climate change, there was a wave of research that just suggested we just need to tell people more. Like if they understood what was at stake, then surely they would be concerned. And I just think that now, after decades, we just know that this is not the case. Like, climate skepticism in the US is at an all-time high, even though arguably we know about it like more than we did 20 years ago, for instance. So what does work? I think understanding the underlying anxieties behind resistance is really, really key. And these underlying anxieties can be economic, or they can also be cultural. So what we did here was we randomized different types of policy designs to see how they affected support. So in the control condition, we just asked individuals, so this is representative samples in Norway, Australia, and the US. And we told them that their Congress or Parliament was considering a new policy to combat climate change, to reduce emissions, et cetera. This is the control condition. We see the typical gender gap, right? Women are more supportive than men. And then we had what we were thinking of as sort of a placebo type of policy, where we said, to do this, they're going to create more jobs. Like this bill is meant to facilitate the green energy transition, and it's going to do it by building out this conservation corps and creating new conservation jobs. Do you support it? And here we see actually men, for some reason, don't like this, although it's not statistically significant from the control. Women, for their part, are about the same, right? But actually the gender gap widens here. And then we included a very similar wording, but instead of saying conservation corps jobs, we were talking about jobs for displaced coal miners or oil workers, depending on the country, and retraining them to work in jobs around renewable energy. And in this case, we see that there's a sizable jump in men's support, right? Women actually, for their part, also seem to like this policy more, which we weren't anticipating, but it closes the gender gap significantly. And if we're most worried about conservative men, because this is the group that is the most reluctant, here I'm just breaking it out by conservative men versus liberal men. Of course, liberals in general are more supportive across the board, but what I want to show you here is that it's not that we just see this jump among individuals who are already liberal or predisposed to care about climate change. Actually, the jump is most pronounced among conservative men, and we don't see a decrease among liberal men, right? So this is something that could have broad base of support across all these different types of cross-cutting cleavages, as we have talked about. Okay, so what are the implications for climate polarization, political polarization on this incredibly important topic? So I think we have identified what previous literature hasn't really uncovered, which is that conservative masculinity in particular is a driver of climate polarization. So if we're going to get anywhere on this issue, we need policies that take this seriously, that treat it seriously. One way to do this, we argue, is to offer compensation for blue-collar workers. Sort of incumbent in this idea is both that blue-collar work tends to be both masculine in the sense that it's typically men who do it, but also masculinized. Like the image of a coal miner or an oil worker is like a very masculinized ethos. And when you compensate in those types of jobs, it might help tap into some of these underlying gender anxieties around climate polarization. And we think that this can meaningfully reduce the gender gap and get support for mitigation. And this is a little bit more troubling, I think, sort of from a normative justice angle, but it suggests that activists and politicians on the left should avoid rhetoric that actually talks about like environmental justice or connects it to environmental racism. These are all things that incredibly matter, but they probably matter for people who already care about the climate crisis. And so if we're thinking about trying to create policies and rhetoric that facilitates the transition to green energy, which we all know that the clock is ticking, as was pointed out earlier, I think we need to think about reframing the rhetoric in that way. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So I'm the last speaker. You may think everything has been said, but I'm reminded of the old line, but not by everybody, so I'm here. So back in 2017, let me say what a pleasure it is to be back here on the program. It says identifies me as a Berkeley alum, before Harvard professor, and indeed that's exactly how I feel about it. So it's great to be. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So back in 2017, I wrote How Democracies Die with Steve Levitsky, and our goal really in that book was to show how polarization had broken democracies in other places and times, Europe in the 1920s and 30s, Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. And so we were worried about what might be coming to the United States. So given that, I can really understand the motivation to ask the question, how do we reduce polarization? and what causes it, and how do we reduce it? But I also am struck by a lot of the conversation today. I think I'm fairly convinced with it and agree with it that this might not always be exactly the right question, or at least maybe not always the most productive. Because polarization, as we've heard from the very first opening remarks this morning, is not an aberration. I mean, it's often with us. It surges, it recedes, takes different forms in different eras, as we heard from Eric. And so I'm kind of reminded here of James Madison, who in Federalist Tens asks not how to eliminate faction, but rather how to mitigate its effects. And so I think maybe thinking about polarization in those ways is useful. So given all of that, I would say a kind of interesting question from my perspective is, why does polarization lead to democratic backsliding in some contexts, but not others? So I'm not going to talk about civil war, and I basically agree with everything you said, I think, so in terms of the prospects for violence. But polarization does lead to democratic backsliding, but not everywhere. Now, one of the things that has always reassured me is some findings from the comparative politics literature. I'm a scholar of comparative politics. I mean, we disagree about most things, but there's two things we agree on. Number one, that rich democracies don't die. No democracy with above a per capita income of $14,000 has ever broken down. The US is at least 4 times richer than that. A second thing, that's based on the past century of data. A second thing that should reassure us is that old democracies don't die. No democracy over the age of 50 has broken down in the past century. So even if we code the United States as having become democratic 1965, 64, 65, which I think is the right way to think about it, the US is certainly older than this. And so what's so striking, though, is that over the past 10 years, according to all the international indices, America has experienced democratic backsliding. And so that's pretty striking. Now, polarization, the rise of the radical right, I noticed the AFD, who I'll talk about in a moment, is right next to the American Republican Party. Polarization, the rise of radical right parties is present in many democracies. They've hit all democracies, but among that cluster of rich old democracies, North America, Western Europe, only the United States has experienced democratic backsliding. So that again raises a puzzle, and one might say polarization has led to democratic backsliding in the United States, but not elsewhere. So why? Now, before we can answer that, I would say we need to be really precise about what kind of polarization we're actually talking about, because I think the conventional left-right framing obscures more than it reveals. So I'm a scholar of European politics, although I got the question wrong from Lucas about birthright citizenship, but I am a scholar of European politics. I'm a director of the Center for European Studies even. Although I think you can become a French citizen at age 18 if you're born in France. You have the choice, so it's not automatic, but basically automatic. Okay, so in any case, I think a look at Europe is actually pretty helpful, because it shows that this conventional left-right kind of framing of the issue is in some ways misleading. I'll just take Germany as an example, thinking of the AFD. So the traditional center-right party in Germany, the CDU, and Germany's traditional center-left party, the SPD, the Social Democrats, have governed together repeatedly over the years, and they're increasingly indistinguishable on large portions of their policy agenda. And there's a kind of running joke in Germany that the conservative CDU chancellor Angela Merkel has been the most successful SPD chancellor in German history. Now, so the real divide in Germany then is different. It's really roughly 30% of the electorate votes for the Alternative for Germany, an anti-democratic extremist and arguably anti-democratic party. And 70% of the electorate votes for parties that, despite all of their differences, share a basic commitment to liberal democratic norms and the post-war constitutional order. Now, so this isn't a left-right cleavage. It's a cleavage between a large democratic majority mainstream and a group of voters who vote for kind of minority party that votes against the system, that challenges the legitimacy of the mainstream entirely. So polarization doesn't really run between right and left, but between 30% of the electorate and about 70% of the electorate. Now, the broader point I would make here is this is not unique to Germany. This roughly 30% is very similar all across Western Europe and in North America. The grievances, the demographic profile, the location of where the voters are, rural base of voters, and so on. This is visible everywhere one looks. So what we can, and this is also, I would argue, visible at the core of the MAGA base of the Republican Party as well. It's what goes by the name, in some sense, of polarization in the United States. So again, this is as a scholar of European politics, despite my knowledge of that particular question, I think this is a real constant, a demographic regularity, striking demographic regularity. One looks at Sweden, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany. There's this around, sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. And I'm kind of reminded here of the political scientist Larry Bartels, who says that populism isn't a wave, it's a deep reservoir. So this is a profound similarity of all of our democracies. Yet all of these democracies facing that same 30% have remained far more robust and resilient. So what this suggests is the problem is not American voters, it's something else. It's the system in which those voters are operating. And I want to talk about two factors in particular that have already been touched on by some of the other panelists today. And so in a sense, unlike Eric, who looks across time in the United States to look at periods where polarization was less and polarization was more, I'm looking across countries and drawing on different kinds of lessons. So in some sense, my eye is attracted to different kinds of variables. So the first factor I would say, as already discussed a bit today, is the structure of American political institutions. And the kind of core issue is something that many of us venerate, the US Constitution. As Jennifer said this morning, our Constitution is a remarkable document, but it overrepresents political minorities. And today, overrepresents rural areas. It's harder for majorities to govern in the United States than in any democracy on earth, between the Senate, the Electoral College, lifetime Supreme Court appointments, and I agree with David here that our two-party system is really critical in this degree as well. All of these institutions amplify political minorities. Now, when those political minorities are ordinary, playing by democratic rules, then this is a kind of normal feature of a political system. But when that minority veers towards authoritarianism, and the political representatives that 30% votes for turns away from democratic norms, this architecture becomes pretty dangerous for democracy. So what all of this means is that in the United States, of course, we all know you can lose the popular vote by millions and win the presidency. You can represent tens of millions of fewer citizens, their opponents, and control the Senate. You can use procedural hardball to gain a political party and then also shape the Supreme Court. And no other democracy are any of these outcomes even thinkable. So just to make the point utterly clear, we're the only democracy in the world with an electoral college. We're the only democracy in the world with lifetime appointment for the Supreme Court, and we have the third most malapportioned Senate, or second chamber in the world. So in the face of all of these unique challenges layered on top all of each other, as well as our two-party system, we have to stop and ask, what incentives does this unleash on politicians? And so what we argue, Steve Levitsky in our book, Tyranny in the Minority, we argue that this leads to a kind of radicalization of that minority party. Because the party doesn't need to broaden its coalition, it doesn't need to win over skeptical voters, and it can leverage its structural advantages in the political system to entrench power in a way that wouldn't normally operate in a democracy. So let me just turn back to Germany again as a point of contrast. Germany's system creates many of the opposite incentives. Proportional representation means seats track votes. Coalition requirements mean no single party governs alone. You must negotiate. And crucially, I think what's really critical is the AfD, despite winning over 20% of the national vote, and actually now probably 30% of the vote, cannot govern. At the national level, every other party has maintained what Germans call a firewall, Brandmauer, refusing coalition with the AfD. Now, the institutional logic of a proportional system makes this possible. So this 30% in the German context is large, it's loud, but it's contained. In the United States, we have a very different kind of outcome in a two-party system. So that's one factor, and I'll come back to some of the downsides of this. I mean, I don't think this is a panacea by any measure. There's some problems with this, but that's just worth pointing out that difference. Institutions alone, I think, don't make all of the difference, because what we've seen in other places is that politicians can leverage institutions to their advantage. Think of Hungary, think of Poland. So a second macro variable, I would say, that really matters a lot, that mediates whether polarization leads to backsliding, is in a sense what we can think of as elite capacity. That is the role of civil leaders, civic leaders, and political leaders. And the willingness of these leaders to hold the line under pressure. And this is where I think a comparative view is actually very helpful, especially with an eye on Germany, but also recently in Brazil, South Korea. In the last several years, both in Brazil and in South Korea, we've had very similar attacks on government buildings, martial law attempt in Korea, Bolsonaro attacking government buildings after losing an election in Brazil. And let's stick with Germany for a moment. In all of these cases, what we see is civic leaders, political leaders, maintaining a firewall against extremism. In Germany, political leaders, business leaders, labor leaders have condemned the AfD, refused to cooperate with the AfD at the national level. Just a kind of one interesting story, and this is a story of polarization. And I kind of ask you to think, is this a good polarization or a bad polarization? In the Bundestag, there's elevators going up in the old Reichstag building in Berlin. Elevators, or members of parliament take the elevators up to the main chambers. There's several elevators. All of the other parties take one elevator. The AfD rides an elevator by itself. Nobody will get in the elevator with the AfD. And so, that's polarization. The reason they don't do this, they don't want to be seen publicly with the AfD. Is this holding a strong line against what people say as a neo-Nazi party? Is that the right thing to do or not the right thing to do? I would suggest that it's useful in terms of delegitimizing them. But I guess to come back to the point here, there is a way this is useful. I think it prevents polarization, and at least in the short run, from leading to democratic backsliding. And it's rooted in, a kind of broader point I would make, it's rooted in a particular approach to history. And I think one thing to think about is the way in which a memory culture can be constructed to make elites aware of the threats to democracy. So German school children study the precise mechanisms by which Weimar collapsed. And this creates a widely shared kind of threat model in people's minds in which citizens and elites recognize democratic backsliding. I think in the United States, we don't quite have an equivalent. Americans are broadly taught that democracy is the natural condition of American life and not a fragile achievement requiring persistent vigilance. And so, we think about the history of Reconstruction, the degree to which for a century it was whitewashed, and in a certain way we're now re-entering a kind of period like that again. And so the point here is by having an active, robust memory culture, I think it helps elites, civic leaders, political leaders understand the stakes of democratic threats and take a hard line against it. Okay, so it's possible this model won't endure in Germany. One might say that it's a short-run fix. In many ways, there's a pitfall of the system, is that by excluding parties over the long run, this creates serious problems of legitimacy. I recognize that. But at least in the short run, the contrast is jarring. Facing similar kinds of polarization, we just saw some of the numbers. German democracy has not experienced democratic backsliding to the same degree the United States has today. So what follows from all of this? I guess not really a cure for polarization, but I guess I don't think that 30%, this would be an interesting question to raise, is that 30% going anywhere? I mean, is that 30% tapped into in David's experiments? I mean, can that 30% be reduced? There's a difference between 20%, 30%. But at least that the persistence of it across many democracies suggests to me this may be a kind of demographic reality that we're all facing. Certainly we need to address this, but at least in the short run, this is there. And in the short run, I guess I'm a pragmatist and a realist, and the task is not to dissolve the cleavage. The task is to build systems that can contain its consequences. Now, for the long run, I think it is clear that we do need to think more broadly and more ambitiously, and I would kind of emphasize two things. One, a kind of agenda of institutional reform, not as a partisan project, but as a structural one, and this I echo some of Eric's comments earlier. Constitutional amendments, I mean, these seem like a far stretch, and they're not on the agenda today. Electoral college reform, first past the post-electoral system, which doesn't require, as we've heard also from Jennifer, doesn't require a constitutional amendment. These are specific institutions that we have today, that we live with today. Our Constitution has been reformed before, and I think if we never even talk about it and think it's illegitimate, it certainly will never be changed. With the American Constitution, part of the reason we are such a democratic system as of 2016 is because we've been willing to reform the Constitution at points. So this is something that people need to continue to talk about, even if it's not going to happen today or tomorrow. It needs to be part of our discourse. The second implication, as I would say, we need to take seriously this kind of notion of a cultivation of a democratic memory culture. Not, of course, nostalgia, not culture war, but a deliberate investment and a shared understanding of what democratic erosion looks like, how it happens, what steps can be taken, in particular by civic and political leaders to stop it. Because I think one of the things I've been most struck by in the first year and so of the Trump administration is the degree in which everyday citizens demonstrate much more courage than those with the most. And so I think it's really critical, as we look around at other democracies around the world, that those civic leaders are the ones who really have the most important role to play. Thank you.
Thank you all for a rich discussion, and we'll open it up for Q&A. I see lots of hands. Okay, maybe we go from, the microphone is in the back. Shall we then start with the back?
All right, thanks. Really interesting panel. Great to hear all of the comments. I guess I'm going to respond just a little bit to Scott's framing, just because I think there's a pretty big range, I think, that Dan gets at between active civil war and the kinds of disruptions that make democracy ineffective. So just like one example, think about violence. Threats against members of Congress have tripled in the last decade with real effects on their decision making. For example, I don't think Pete Hegseth would have been confirmed as defense secretary if not for Tom Tillis's the threats he and his family received. So and then that, in terms of institutions like the military, Hegseth's mission is to reshape that culture. So I guess I think that, and similarly with elections, it's not that very many people think they would be canceled. The question is, are there actions that can be taken that undermine the faith and the integrity and ability of at least some people to vote without fear of consequences? So I guess I just sort of encourage to think about a kind of range of outcomes with civil war. Civil war at one end, but a lot of potential for democratic backsliding, as I think Daniel talked about in between. So maybe more a comment than a question, but.
Yeah, I mean, is this on? Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think you can think about what I was doing as perhaps putting a bookend on, well, I do think there's a lot of speculation that polarization leads to large-scale violence. And I just wanted to kind of bring in the literature on civil war to kind of bookend that analysis. So, but yeah, I totally agree. And and I think there are lots of ways in which violence is part of the political process right now. But I don't see, all the things that we've been talking about today just strike me as very far from people deciding that they're going to organize an insurgency and fight for political power. And that's sort of the point that I was making. But I don't disagree with either what you said or what Dan said in terms of backsliding. That wasn't my question. So, yeah.
Hello. This is a question, I think, mostly for Dan. So there's a recent paper called Political Representation Gaps and Populism, which shows that in Europe, across 27 countries, the average MP was one standard deviation to the left of the average voter on a range of issues, including immigration, et cetera. And it shows very neatly that essentially what happened is that the median voter theorem did not hold in these countries, which is why the AfD and other parties sprang into existence actually around the median in these cultural issues. So what does it mean if we take seriously that these right-wing, extreme, anti-democratic parties actually represent preferences of citizens?
Yeah, so a couple of things about that. One, I think it's really important to distinguish among populist parties. Populism comes in many forms. The Le Pen's party will have nothing to do with the AfD because she thinks they're too extreme. So they don't group together in the European Parliament. So there's certain parties, so I was spending a summer teaching in Switzerland, and I was asking about the Swiss populists, and people were saying, the Swiss populists and the German populists are very different. German authoritarians are just worse than Swiss authoritarians, which, So the point of that, though, is that there are differences. And so how do we, aside from national stereotypes and so on, how do we distinguish between them? And I think it's really important to be very explicit about, and I struggle quite a bit with this, because most Germans will say that the AfD, most Germans that I interact with say that the AfD is authoritarian, and I tend to push back on that actually and say, okay, tell me how exactly. And so I think it's really important to have clear criteria. And so the criteria that I use are, number one, do you use violent rhetoric, and do you associate with those who use violence or threaten to use violence? The AfD, there's certain elements in the AfD that do that. Other parties, that's not necessarily the case. A second kind of key criteria is, do you promise, if you're in office or once in office, do you attack the civil liberties of citizens? And so, regarding the AFD, there was this thing that prompted a massive outpouring of millions of citizens, this kind of secret meeting that took place in which there was a proposal to remove citizenship rights of citizens with migration background, and actually the remigration force, which is something, of course, that now has come to the U.S. as well. But that's something that's a clear assault on basic democratic rules. So one can come up with a set of criteria by which one distinguishes between policy preferences, limiting migration, which may be something that some people are on one side of or on another side of, and positions that essentially mean you don't accept the basic rules of the democratic game. So I think it's really important to be explicit about that. So I think that's important. A second thing to say is just that these systems aren't perfect, of course, and there are these representation gaps, and the challenge for the mainstream parties, if they want to continue to win, is to figure out how to address these concerns. And I think there have been shifts on migration in response to this. And so it's sending a signal to politicians that they need to get their act together, and hopefully they do. So I think in that sense, that's how I sort of think about these issues.
I was really interested in your last point on the importance of the cultivation of an American culture, or a democratic culture. But I want to ask, how would you assess the erosion of public education in the U.S. that starts with kindergarten all the way through high school and through university, and the decline in democratic events, debates, discussions, classes in civics, little citizenships councils in grade school, et cetera, that was a very important part of democratic culture, at least when I was growing up many years ago.
Yeah, I'm really not an expert on the state of this. I mean, I do know that this varies across states, and across communities. I know in Massachusetts, there's been a real renewed effort to include civics education in middle school. And so some of that is very good. So I think there are positive developments. Other people recognize this. I guess my call is simply, this is a long-term investment. This is a kind of proposal that really, isn't going to pay off in the next, this is not something that's going to have the effects that we just saw in the last panel with these interventions, over the course of several weeks making a difference. But I think that doesn't mean it's not important. And there's lots of people doing work on this. Others recognize it. And I think just taking the comparative view can teach us that these things do make a difference.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the 3 presentations. Amazing. So I'm a European political scientist, and I'll follow up on the parties, on the extremes in Europe. Don't you think there is a tendency also for the extremes to go to the center in order to gain political legitimacy? And isn't there the risk that although political positions, especially on the basics of liberal democracy, get more moderated, once they're in power, they tend to attack the basic institutions of democracy? Now, where do I come from? I'm Italian. So my prime minister at the moment comes from a very extreme party, but she doesn't seem to be so extreme anymore, and she's proposing a constitutional reform. But I also have a Hungary and Poland in mind, and France also. There is no extreme party in government yet. Thank you.
So I do, again, there's differences across democracies. So there's this idea that if you give somebody responsibility, that they will moderate, and that's possible. I think there are instances where it may work, but my general take on this, it's a kind of high risk proposition. And just as one can drink and drive home, maybe on some nights, it's risky. I don't do that because I find that risky. So I have a kind of I have a risk aversion. So, if asked, I would say, why take that risk? If there's a party that's showing its colors, why take that risk? There's the potential, possibility that this strengthens the party by keeping them out. But, I think it depends on each case. But there's some cases, as I mentioned, the AFD is the most clear-cut case of this. But it's a hunch, it's a hypothesis. There are instances in Austria, for instance, where the extreme right has been in power and embarrassed itself and discredited itself. But once that threshold is passed, then they do tend to come back. So it's not a one-shot kind of game. So, to me, the optimal solution is for mainstream parties to recognize these problems and address these problems.
So this question's from Amanda. Can you say a little more about why manly men? I'm an academic, so I have no idea who these people are. Why they are especially skeptical of climate change? I would think one spending outside, hunting, fishing, having their own leaf blower. I don't know what manly men do, but could you say a little more about that?
Sure. I mean, I also don't know if I know from a place of lived experience, but I think that we're talking a lot about hegemonic masculinity or conservative masculinity. So that's part of it. It's not just that you like hunting or something like that. It's that you believe in very strict gender roles and you believe in men's place on them. So we also have a lot of questions about your support for women's rights, for instance. And those people who are most antagonistic towards women's rights are also more likely to be climate skeptical. And we have a lot of reasons why we think this is the case. We think one of it we're pulling from both social psychologists and also economists and thinking about loss aversion. So if you have always been sort of atop the social hierarchy, you can think of other groups that have historically enjoyed privilege too. Thinking about change feels really, really threatening. And so one response to that is to pretend it doesn't exist. So when political elites start to have these climate skeptical messages and saying, it's not as bad as people think, if you have the highest levels of social privilege, you're going to be more likely to want to agree with those versus people who are sort of lower on the ladder and are like, things aren't that great anyway, I want to change. So I think that's part of it. I think that's the sort of identity psychological dimension. We think that there's sort of a more economic dimension to it too, but I'll end there. Thanks.
I think it's a lot simpler answer.
Yeah, that's part of it. So you said that the manly man prefers the big truck, which has a larger carbon footprint, and there's a lot of work that suggests it's called petromasculinity, that burning carbon is associated for some men with certain types of masculinity, and they're going to have to pay more at the pump, or et cetera. So all of these things, I think, touch on a certain type of identity that go beyond actually just the cost of decarbonization, too.
Of civil violence, I seized this microphone from Desmond.
Okay.
So
I'll forgive this only because it's Jack.
So I could ask this question really pretty much of every speaker today. How much is all of this about Donald Trump? How much of everything that we're saying would this assume Donald Trump was not elected in either 2016 or 2024? How much of Daniel's backsliding of democracy would you have even written your book, Daniel? So that's, and really, if you think, Eric has pointed out, there have been ups and downs in political polarization. We've heard that there's regular good polarization and bad polarization, or toxic, or pernicious, or horrendous. You can keep on trucking there. But all of it seems to be tacked on to two things, to a lesser extent, the Republicans in general, okay? Newt Gingrich was mentioned earlier. Of course, Newt Gingrich operated after a period of one-party rule of 54 years in Congress, so maybe he had to think of another strategy if they were ever going to win, so we can like that or dislike it. But the thing is, Donald Trump tomorrow has one too many hamburgers. He's gone. Okay, what's going to happen? 2028. Gee, hopefully not our governor, but some other person is elected. And, we have a different world. So there are structural things you've been talking about, the Electoral College, primaries, all of those things I think are valid points, but they existed for a long time before all of this debate began. So it's just, I mean, I don't know the answer to this question, but it just struck me that so much of what's going on here is linked to Trump's emergence.
Anyone want to take that question?
Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, if we were to have a political conversation in the year 2026 and not be motivated by that, we would be kind of insane. I mean, so it's a part of our political reality. So of course that's in the background of what we're doing. But I think, I would say over the past year, to me, the most shocking thing is less the behavior of Donald Trump and much more the degree to which backsliding has taken place, or the degree of the assault on democracy. It's not only about Donald Trump, it's much more, it's also important roles played by Congress and the kind of, circumventing of the normal rules of democratic legislation, the role of the Supreme Court. I mean, it's a much bigger institutional story. And Trump, as the cliche goes, I mean, he's both a symptom and a cause of this. And so trying to get at the symptom part of this I think is partly what people are trying to get at.
Marika.
Thanks. I wrote down my question, but there we go. So this is sort of for Professor Straus and Professor Ziblatt. You talked about sort of exclusion as this really important factor in thinking about what role polarization could play. And I found myself wondering whether you mean stories of exclusion that people tell themselves, or actual sort of factual exclusion, like we might throw, GDP per capita in a regression model. And it seems like, there was a question earlier about AI and the importance of it. Feels like stories of exclusion are very easy to manufacture. They're very satisfying. They can fly around in contravention of fact. So the second part of the question is for Professor Ziblatt. You talked about this question of memory and its implications for how people behave. How hard or easy do you think it is now relative to something like the gathering of historians from France and Germany after World War II settling on textbook content? Now, could you even have that conversation about agreeing on a memory that we all can share? Because it feels like you both are touching on a similar thing, that it's important to have certain guardrails in place, and stories seem very easy to fabricate right now, and agreeing on a single story seems like a very big lift. So I'm sort of asking this question to both of you.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess, it's certainly a big lift. What I would suggest is, people should be studying this and do these interventions kind of work. I mean, that would be one point. In the same way that we've heard about some interventions today, I think that would be interesting. And there are people working on this, I need to note. That's one thing. Another idea that just popped into my head as you said it is there's this wonderful book by historian Alain Confino about German local identity and national identity. And the title of the book is The Nation as Local Metaphor. And it's one of these great books where the title, tells you everything you need to know. And the basic claim of the book is that if you look at national history in Germany, it's actually just a series of regional histories. When you go to regional museums, everybody has their local regional hero. I think one sees this actually in Italy as well. With the history of the Risorgimento, you go around in different regions of Italy, and the story is told of national unification, but the local heroes are the ones who are, we kind of get this in the United States as well. Having grown up in California, you'll learn all about the missions and this California history. My kids go to school in Massachusetts, all they hear about is Plymouth Rock, right? So there are these different regional stories that accumulate to the national story. So everybody believes there's a kind of collective hypocrisy in a certain way, where people don't realize that they're attached to this abstract idea, but in very different ways. So this is something where I think it is possible, despite incredible heterogeneity, to kind of believe in similar stories. But on the other hand, I think the job is, so we've had the experience recently at my university where somebody described this to me, so it's secondhand, where in a discussion, in a seminar, in a public seminar, somebody said, well, January 6th, we don't really know what happened. Can one ever really know what really happened? Everything is ambiguous, really. All events are ambiguous. And rather than that being met by kind of counter-argument and the kind of new era of civility, people sort of just are quiet. And so for those who don't really know what to think, that silence sends a message. So I think that doesn't, what I'm saying is that we don't need consensus, but we need argument about these things. And silence is like actually the worst possible outcome.
So I'll just answer quickly. Thanks, Marika, for the question. I mean, I think, look, I believe in the power of narratives, but what I was referring to was the concentration of power with a kind of material power, the state, the economy, that is concentrated on a particular group to the exclusion of access to that power of other groups, right? And so, but stories of exclusion are rife, and they do matter, and they are part of the story, but there's usually a really significant there. It's like this group has had access to the state and controlled government for 30 years, and we are not allowed to access it, and that's what prompts violence. That's the model I had in mind. Yeah.
Jake?
Thank you very much for the wonderful talks, very insightful. I have a question for Professor Ziblatt. I had the privilege of listening to one of the webinars you held with Professor Levitsky on the How Democracies Die book. It was back in 2022, I think, so many updates from that. And you mentioned the fragmentation of the Democratic Party in the US, and now that I'm realizing that you're a European scholar, I was wondering if you noticed that across countries in Europe? Is it US specific? Maybe there are examples to learn from, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, so I think I understand what you're asking. So, I mean, the fragmentation, I think one of the big drivers of the success, as we heard in this representation gap point that was made earlier, one of the big drivers of the success of these kinds of parties is the failure of mainstream parties, the shrinking of mainstream parties. So if you look at the kind of total vote share of, the main center-right and center-left parties that were the main post-war parties, it's shrinking everywhere. I mean, especially in proportional systems. And so this kind of fragmentation of the political landscape creates an opportunity structure for new parties to come along, which maybe is okay in terms of people are getting their voices heard and so on. But it does lead to dysfunction. It does lead to kind of gridlock, stalemate, and so on. So. What's exactly driving that? I mean, there's lots of forces driving that. And the challenge is how can these parties, I mean, I continue to think these, where you have more consolidated party systems, democracy is more stable. What happened in Italy was driven by the complete collapse of the party system. France, you've had the complete collapse of the French party system. Macron kind of held it together, but the next presidential elections, things may look very different. So I think there, I'm kind of a conservative in this way. I think the stability of old parties is actually a kind of leads to more democratic stability cross-nationally.
Jake?
Thank you. Three variables that I haven't heard come up that are unique to the U.S. right now, so thinking across time, like Eric and you guys comparatively. One is high-end wealth concentration, very unique in the U.S., top 40 dudes, and to Professor Clayton, they're all dudes. More concentrated wealth at the high end, and Musk particularly, the richest man in the history of the universe, how that interacts with institutional challenge, the initial constitutional crisis of Doge and so forth. Second is gerontocracy, the U.S. by far the oldest set of national politicians, doubling up many of these consolidated democracies we've heard so far. And third is what's happened with every other situation of potential backsliding has had a student protest movement fight against this backsliding. In the US, the Liberal Party joined with the Conservative Party over recent years to crush student protests and the uniqueness of that bipartisan anti-student protest coalition. Those three things seem quite unique and haven't come up in thinking about these variables. Thanks.
I don't have much to add. Those are really interesting observations. I mean, there are many gerontocratic states that I study in Africa where the leaders are very extremely old and they've been in power for a very long time. But I don't know that that would necessarily be a fair analogy. But your other point, these are really interesting observations. I mean, the sort of plutocracy, I mean, Omar Wassa has written about this a little bit. Yeah, I don't, it's a really interesting observation. I don't have much to add. Thank you, yeah.
But is there, I mean, I don't like inequality, but it's always tempting to say that all the things that we don't like are correlated with each other. And so I guess my question back to you is, I mean, what's the evidence that inequality is driving polarization?
increasing concentrated wealth in the tech sector and concentration allows for more mafioso institutional threats of hostile regulation to bend the knee to consolidate power within the regime, whereas more spread out corporate governance and wealth holding and more manufacturing and sticky, as the Acemoglu and Robinson's type of sticky capital really matters here. So the fact that it's Musk, Ellenson, CBS, TikTok ownership, and so forth is the initial constitutional crisis seems like a mechanism to me.
Yeah. The one thing go ahead. I mean, the stock market has huge numbers of stakeholders in it. And yes, I'm not denying the concentration that you're describing, but there are many footholds, many incentives that are dispersed across the United States. And so, I don't know, it's like when I look at the situation, I think about violence as a very high cost. And what is it that you lose from violence, right? That's something that I think that sticks out to me. A lot of people would lose a lot of the wealth that they have.
The only Supreme Court thing that stopped any executive action this term has been to protect the Fed and Jerome Powell a little bit.
Right.
So.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, somebody had said earlier that the last guardrail is voters. I think the last guardrail is really the bond market.
Thank you. Yeah. We've all been talking a very broad brush, but reference has been made to the support for Trump, especially the second election of Trump and the resulting whatever we have. And I'm wondering, it seems to me a crucial aspect to that is the failure of the Democratic Party. We have two parties, generally big parties with lots of overlap in the middle, but the failure of the Democratic Party since Clinton to provide the alternative, to continue the FDR, the LBJ types of values, and Clinton to simply be another version of the Reagan policies. And so people, seems to me, have been desperate for trying something else. So they went ahead and voted for Trump. They didn't expect to get, I think, or most of them didn't expect to get what we've gotten. But anyway, but it seems to me that that can largely explain, again, in broad brush, how it is that we are where we are.
Yeah, can I just say one thing? I mean, certainly the Democratic Party deserves criticism, but one thing one needs to say is that in a democracy, just because one party loses power doesn't mean your democracy should be, that you suffer democratic backsliding. I mean, I think to me, yeah, and so, I mean, so there's other factors at work, certainly, but, we have to keep in mind that, when people ask, will the Republicans accept the next election? Will the midterm election? The fact that we're asking this question, I mean, this is, as a scholar of comparative politics, this is the definition of a deconsolidated democracy, is that you don't believe in the rules of the game. And so at some basic level, that's sort of the more essential problem from my perspective.
All right, this will be the last question.
Thank you for your presentations and all the others before you. I want to turn to a follow-up of your question about the press, the social media, the dissenters. They've all been kneecapped, all right? The press economically is not going to work anymore. They don't have advertisers. That's not necessarily because of this administration. The social media is all with the oligarchs, to borrow Bernie's phrase. The lawyers, okay? This is big law that they kneecapped, but what they're doing in the courts and the rule of law is frightening. So I feel pretty pessimistic about the vote. Everything this president has said he's going to do, the things I just mentioned, he's delivered on them more than he could have ever hoped for. And now they're talking about the vote. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's very scary to think that the vote is going to either not take place, or Trump will put in troops or ICE or whatever. So what's the hope so that we won't be pessimistic leaving?
That's great. Leave us with some hope.
Well, I would just say, yeah, I don't know, can I say something? I mean, I'm not in the hope business, but yeah. No, but I think there is something to be said for, I mean, it's in people's hands. I mean, it's not like the script has already been written. And it's not as if the script has already been written. And, certainly Trump's approval ratings aren't particularly high. And I take Scott's point very seriously that actually, the kind of as bad as the oligarchs and the inequality is, the kind of nature of the structure of the American economy with centers of wealth spread out across the country, in California, New York, Massachusetts, means that it's really hard. First of all, it's really hard to steal an election. And we shouldn't underestimate that. It's very hard to steal an election. And second of all, I think American civil society and society is actually, in cross-national perspective, is one of the most well-placed to actually defeat this challenge. And so I think you have to have two thoughts in your mind at the same time, and it's not a contradiction, which is to say we face an authoritarian assault. But on the other hand, American society is actually particularly well-placed to fight back against it. So, and one of my favorite lines is, nobody's ever defeated authoritarianism from the sidelines. So I think that's sort of I just remind myself of that.
Good to end on that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. This is really great, and we'll turn things over to David to close us off.
Great. So before I let you go, or actually before I turn it over to Professor Straus, our department chair, to let you go, just a few words of thanks I wanted to say. So first of all, of course, to Ron Epstein and the Tideline Foundation for their partnership, for both on today's event, as well as a lot of the work that you're seeing here is enabled by them. Also, I want to acknowledge Mindy Frankel, who's here, another great partner to BCAD, who's allowed a lot of what we've done here today as well. So thank you, Mindy. And last, the loudest round of applause I'd love to give to our wonderful staff who made today possible. I always say that our staff are our secret weapon here. They are just so incredible. So thank you so much. So I'm looking forward to meeting many of you at the reception, and I'll turn it over to our department chair, Professor Straus, to close.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and thanks to David for pulling this all together. I mean, yeah. I also, David and I were coordinating, we both need to thank the staff, but I just one more round because, the logistics to make this possible are really significant. Serena was here until, our department manager, until I think 11:30 last night. Christine Nera has been working on tickets, Stacey Owens, Eva Soto. I mean, a whole bunch of people really worked incredibly hard to make today happen. And so that's the behind-the-scenes labor that really deserves a lot of credit. So thank them. Yeah, I just wanted to close by saying, I hope that what you saw here today is really what we do every day. This is our bread and butter. As we have ideas, we debate, we present arguments, we present data, and I think it's really important that we get that message out, because I think universities are being attacked as places that are closed-minded and where curiosity is not fostered and what have you. And really to that end, we really want to try to engage in a little bit more outreach and engagement with our alumni, especially as our sort of first circle. And so, as David said earlier, we hope to maybe do some online programming or other kinds of events like this. But we really welcome your engagement, and I really encourage you either to talk to me or any other faculty member or David if you have ideas or things that you would want. I think we really, as a public institution especially, have a mission to try to have of outreach. And so I think it's particularly important at this moment as well. So thank you all for being here for this whole day, and I hope you really enjoyed it. And I look forward to seeing you at the reception. So take care.